We're still checking in.
Great. So making sure that I have everything recorded and ready to go. Great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Holly Medill, and I'm the director of the National Charrette Institute at Michigan State University. The National Charrette Institute, or NCI, is partnering with the Form-Based Codes Institute to bring you a webinar series about how to shift what we do from in-person to online processes. Our first webinar focused on taking charrettes virtual. The second focused on important considerations of virtual community engagement and highlighted some tools. And we're excited to round out this series with a panel discussion on inclusivity in the digital environment. We are recording this webinar, and after it is closed captioned, we will post it on both the NCI and FBCI websites. We'll also send the link to you in a follow-up email. So we had over 830 people register for this webinar from 12 countries represented across the globe. Hello from Michigan and Washington, D.C., in the US to Austria, Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, Germany, France, Greece, Singapore, Israel, Mexico, and South Africa. And hello to most of the states in the US as well. I'm very pleased to welcome our panel of speakers and join Marta Goldsmith from the Form-Based Codes Institute to bring you today's webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for sharing their time, wisdom, and experiences with us today. I'd also like to thank Harmonika Masel with MSU Extension, Amy Lockwood from MSU IT Services, and Jade Deshays from Locus for their behind-the-scenes tech support. So our agenda is pretty basic today, but here's a quick look at it. Marta and I are going to provide a quick overview of our organizations before we begin with a panel discussion. And following the panel, there will be time for questions of the speakers. So as questions develop for you throughout our time today, type them into the Q&A box and Marta and Jade will monitor them. We'll take as many as we can during the Q&A time, and if we fall short, we'll include responses in a recap that will notify you is available when the recording is available as well. So a quick word on NCI, which was founded in 2000 in Portland, Oregon as a nonprofit with a mission to train practitioners to help communities achieve self-transformation using the method of charrettes. In 2016, NCI's curriculum came to Michigan State University, and it's now housed within the School of Planning, Design, and Construction, where it joins 4 degree granting programs, urban planning, construction management, interior design, and landscape architecture. We think about the built environment from the inside out, holistically, and at multiple scales. NCI is also closely associated with MSU Extension. In addition to coaching and conducting charrettes, we provide certificate trainings on how to prepare for and conduct charrettes. We've trained over 3,500 practitioners across the globe. And our goal in training is based on transferring 30 years of learnings of how to do charrettes and transferring both those victories and some mistakes to our practitioners and people involved in community engagement so they can learn from those and be more successful. We are working to incorporate, have been, and are working to incorporate elements of diversity, equity, inclusion into our curriculum to ensure that we are preparing inclusive processes. And so I'm especially excited about today's discussion. Marta?
Thank you, Holly. Begin by introducing you to Smart Growth America. Smart Growth America is a national organization. Our North Star envisions a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. We work with communities across the country and even outside the country through technical assistance, advocacy, and thought leadership to realize our vision of livable places, healthy people, and shared prosperity. And we're pleased to have the President and CEO of Smart Growth America as one of our panelists today. As you can see, we are a multiple multifaceted team of programs that work on all aspects of smart growth. Holly? Next slide. Form-Based Codes Institute has actually been in existence for almost 20 years and joined Smart Growth America and as a partner and a family member about 2.5 years ago. We provide information, education, technical assistance, exemplary codes, and serve as a forum for discussion about land use regulation as a framework for smart growth. And we are thrilled to be joining NCI today on this very timely webinar. I could say a lot more about that and how timely it is, but I think I would rather defer to our panelists. So Holly, let's get started. So our panelists have been introduced. You can read their bios on the registration page, and we are especially pleased to have these folks here today to talk about the issue of equitable inclusion in community engagement, and particularly virtual community engagement. We've had 2 webinars talking about tools and techniques and major issues, and the topic came up again and again in our last 2 webinars. So without further ado, I'm going to start and put forward a question that I'd like each of our panelists to answer, and I'll start with you, Ashley. What does equitable inclusion in community engagement mean to you and the work you do in Memphis?
Thank you, Marta. That's a great question. So I come from the city of Memphis. I work in government. I lead the city's Office of Comprehensive Planning. And within that, we do a lot of community engagement and have to engage different types of communities from a racial perspective, from an equity perspective, accessibility perspective, et cetera. And so really, when we think about equitable inclusion, it is what are we doing? How are we being proactive to make sure that there is space available for everyone who wishes to participate in the change in their community, so everyone can be a power holder in that. And what are we doing to figure that out? And so a lot of times it's, governments maybe, or many others may look at public meetings, but it's really thinking about, is this meeting meeting the folks that it needs to be meeting? And are we doing all that we can to ensure that we're meeting that, at least that threshold? And so when I think about equity and inclusion, I'm really excited to come to this discussion about bringing it to virtual. But for my work, and I'm sure many others on this webinar, it's something that we are and have always been thinking about. How do we make sure that we are inclusive in our engagement?
Thank you. Thank you. Calvin, I know this is something you think about a lot. What does it mean to you?
Maybe I'll say something rogue here. I know a lot of folks will probably, that's why they want me on the panel, will talk about the process and talk about the equitability of the process and the input and who gets input and how. What equitable inclusion means to me, in addition to those things, is a difference in the outcomes. So you can follow an equitable process, get all the input, have a diversity of input, allow different types of input. But if nothing changes in terms of the ultimate decisions that are going to be made, to me, that's not equitable inclusion. The inclusion is irrelevant if none of the outcomes change. Now, that isn't to say that all the input turns the decisions based on the input, but if all the input just translates into, thanks for telling us that, we'll put that into a slide deck that we'll talk about later, then to me, that's not equitable inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us that rogue perspective. Ebony.
Sure, and I might have one that's somewhere between both Ashley and Calvin. And so I think about equity in 3 ways. So there's process, which involves participation, and then there's what Calvin said, which is about outcome. And so I think the first 2 we're talking about are the voices representative of the community, right? And so whatever your community looks like demographically, that's what sort of the voices that are a part of whatever planning process that should be your goal, right? And so if it's 80% whatever and 20% whatever, whether that's age, whether that's race, whether that's income, whether that's geography, that should also be the goal for representation in your process, so that those voices are representative of the community. I think highlighting and prioritizing and specifically making extra efforts to engage the community of folks that have marginalized identity, particularly those identities that have been historically marginalized. I think in the same way, so that can be income, that can be race, that can be ethnicity, that can be ability and age, what that means for your community. Those are the ones that come to my mind. I think that the opportunity to have real impact. So a lot of engagement processes that I know I've been asked to do are actually check boxes. Either folks kind of have an idea of what they're going to do, or it's really on the input. So a lot of us know about the spectrum of a community engagement. They're really on, the informer input. And so I'm equitable and inclusion and engagement means we are really going from consulting, collaborating, and empowering. And so I think that that's what it means to me. The last couple things I'll say is what Calvin said, the outcome. Is this development actually going to benefit equitably the entire community, or is it just economically the developer? Like what are the benefits of engaging not only this process but the outcome, and are those going to be distributed throughout the community? Basically, who's going to be benefiting and who's burdened? If that's also not equitable, then who cares about your process? The outcome is still the same. And so I think that covers it. And obviously moving towards empowering people. So you're giving them the skills and the know-how to understand planning processes so they can be empowered to have a voice also in future processes.
Great, thank you. Good addition, good thought. And Karen, I'm sure you have some other things to add, and what does it mean to you to be community engagement and inclusiveness in community engagement?
Thanks, Marta. Well, I mean, Ebony, Ashley, and Calvin covered it pretty well, so, but I can always add things. So, it's interesting the way Calvin framed it, because what I see often is that people talk about, well, we can figure out an outcome, but we don't need to include them in the process, right? So I actually think it's always remembering it's both a just process and a just outcome. You have to have both, and you can't have either one. And, there's a great, Sasha Costanza-Chock wrote a great book called Design Justice, and she's focused more on the technology community, designing apps and things like that. But she has one of her chapter that the title of her chapter is Nothing About Us Without Us. And I think it's important to continually remind people that we can't represent people that aren't ourselves. We're not gonna, everyone has their own experience to bring to the table, and everyone is going to come up with solutions that nobody but they can come up with. And so if their voices are not a genuine part of the conversation, then we're missing out on potential solutions. Another important piece of that is, to what we were talking about earlier about the harms and the benefits. And almost inevitably, if you dig deep, the harms are going to the less powerful and the benefits are going to the more powerful. And so equitable inclusion is about really digging deep into those harms and benefits and analyzing, really being honest about who is benefiting and who is being harmed.
Thank you. That is helpful. And I think among the four of you, you've really sort of hit all the key notes in thinking about equitable inclusion as you go through your community engagement process. But let's break this down a little bit. And Ebony, so when you work with a community to design a community engagement process, and I know this is primarily today, we want to talk about virtual community engagement because that's where we are. But I think you have to start with what is important to think about as you design a community engagement process, regardless of whether it's virtual or face-to-face. What do communities need to think about first?
Well, I think whether you're sort of local government like Ashley or consulting like some of the other of us on this call, you always have to think about your audience and your context, right? And so, like I said before, who are you trying to engage and why? And what is the breadth and depth of that? Like really defining that, because that's going to define where you go, who you connect with, what partnerships you make, what kind of outreach and marketing process is going to have, like who's your audience, whether that's a demographic audience, whether that's a geographic audience, and then like actually taking some time to critically think about that. And then who are you going to prioritize, right? So there may be some of those people that are going to come to the table because as part of the context, they're part of the voices that are, you know, just come to meetings or whatever medium you're doing. And who are the folks that are going to be hard to reach, and how are you going to reach those? What extra effort are you going to do in order to get those? And so that can be everything from a variety of identity, whether that's race, whether that's ability, whether that's income. I think you just have to map that out and define that for yourself. And because we don't have infinite resources, and figure out where I'm going to put the energy, who voices absolutely needs to be heard an extra mile. And I think to stretch those resources, I think you think about what are local partners, who's already out there in the community doing the work that has a connection relationship to the constituencies that you're interested in engaging in the process. And how can you work with them to build a relationship with that constituency, right? So instead of me, either local government or out of town consultants saying, hey, come to this meeting, who are the organizations that are either interested in this topic, involved in the community, who you can partner with to co-host a meeting, to really invite their constituencies as part of the process? That's always worked best for me. So looking at that, and as a part of that, how can this process build trust? So I saw that the check boxes that don't work. So there may be previous efforts that you can build upon, right? Or previous mailing lists or interested organizations that you can harness their particular relationship, so that this process is not one and done, but is seen as part of a continuum of engagement throughout the community. I think particularly when you're talking about marginalized identities, we need to talk about incentives. So I get paid for every meeting that I organize and go to and offer my expertise. And I think we need to think about paying people incentives. The last engagement process I did, everybody that came to a focus group got a $25 gift card. And there was sort of raffles if you fill out a survey that people are getting compensated for their time and expertise. And then you include that into the budget. You obviously want to go to them in any extent that you can, and not saying, oh, come to me. And I think, and this relates to, I think, online engagement, is that you have to use a diversity of tools, and preferably tools people are already using. Like I was looking up today, thinking about, so we talked about this on our prep call, like 80% of people have access to a phone, right? Or a smartphone. And then like 92 to 98% of everybody in the US have access to a regular cell phone. That's huge. That's something people already have. So how do you use that in ways that connect to people? Lots of folks are on Facebook, Instagram, so they don't have to download another more complicated, more professional thing, when now Facebook has meeting rooms and you can do Instagram Live. I think we just have to use the mechanisms that people already have access to, that are easy for them, in places that they already are. And I think that opens it up.
Ebony, I'm glad you mentioned those other technology tools, because one of our questions is about in virtual, in these days when we can't meet face to face, what options do we have for virtual connection? Before we move on, I just want to see if the other panelists have, as you start your community engagement, particularly in a virtual context, other things that people need to, that communities and leaders, planners, and others need to think about. You talked about who is your audience, how are you going to reach particular populations, what technology tools, what else do you think you need to consider before you move forward? Karen or Calvin? Ashley? Calvin?
Oh, I have two I consider big ones that I think people forget all the time. The first is, what's the history? I mean, we often have this community engagement moment where we're talking about today's project and some future activity. people are coming with a history, though, of all the different community engagement moments they've been in before, and all the things that they were promised that may or may not have been actually followed through on. And sometimes you'll find, and anybody, and I imagine Ebony and Karen and Ashley have all seen this, and Marta as well, if you're working in this space and you're doing engagement, you've been in an engagement where it's suddenly gone off the rail. And oftentimes that's because there's a history there that wasn't uncovered, it wasn't unlocked. And so we're fighting about things that happened before, and sometimes you need to do that. You need those preceding steps, some way to unlock that history, to kind of know what you're walking into, and also kind of what people's state of mind is when you're having a conversation. So that's one, the history. The second is, what are current events? So right now, if we do a virtual engagement, we're in a crisis of confidence in policing, and that crisis is wrapped in a pandemic. And so you can't just do an engagement right now and not understand that people have all of these other things also going on. So you may have to give additional grace to people, because they are going to even be more antagonistic or antsy or you know, challenged in their ability to communicate in a way that we might consider as professionals respectful or logical or following the process that we set forth. And I think those two things, understanding and taking into account the history, but also being clear on what current events are, and those current events may not be global like a pandemic. It may be something that just happened in that neighborhood last week. Was there recently a shooting that a number of people might be thinking about? And you're like, well, my project has nothing to do with the shooting, but it's going to have something to do with how people engage. So what's going on now and what's going on in the past?
Thank you. I think those are good points that we sometimes forget.
And I just kind of want to add to what Calvin's saying, and perhaps even add questions or points of engagement to get that out, because you're not going to be able to move forward if you don't provide space for people to process that. All right. Then they feel like they've shared what's on their heart. Okay, now we can go to this other thing, but put that as even as part of the process, I think.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I think it is sort of the you know, where are we starting? Where are we going? Where have we been? And I think sort of the current environment, the fact that you can't get with people face to face, and a lot of times that's how most people are accustomed to saying what they think and feel, that you need to create that space for them to get accustomed to a different kind of environment. Karen or Ashley, before we move on, are there other things about what you need to think about as you get started?
I'll just jump in and say, I think the points I'll hit on were very well. And Ebony, when you talked about working with local partners, I think that's so key. One of the things we forget often is when we are going to engage a community, we shouldn't, our first time engaging the community shouldn't be the first time we are having a discussion. So the first time I talk to you and understand where you are, it shouldn't be me saying, what do you want us to do for you? And it's hard. Sometimes you get caught up in the everyday work, but you have to make those spaces to build relationships with whomever those community leaders are, those stakeholders, those important residents. What are those gathering places? And I think in this world of virtual, that's sort of easy for us to do. So we know, okay, at the local coffee shop or at the, you know, soul food restaurant, folks kind of circle in and out, and you can have conversations and get to know community members. But now that we're virtual, how can we create that space? How can we have those prep discussions? So in some cases, you know, a lot of the history that's happened in some communities, in some cases you don't. And so where are you creating those spaces to have those one-on-one or individual conversations with the old timers of the community to really know what's going on, so that you come into a community more empathetic, you understand. And then we found in our work at the city early on, you know, we want to come out and talk about things like land use and building form. And to Calvin's point, you know, you have to give people the space to talk about all those promises that may have been broken and the trust that's been sort of that's devolved over time. And a lot of times the only way to get over that is through action. through commitment and through saying, you know, these situations maybe hasn't been the most comfortable tables to sit at, but we're going to sit here and try to work together. But I think we have to keep that type of commitment as we go virtual, and probably be even more intentional as we engage in these virtual platforms to make sure we're creating the space for folks to still have that sort of natural progression of things.
Right. Right. Karen, on this topic?
Yeah, you know, I just want to add two things. I think, you know, I heard the word heal a couple of times, and I think just recognizing that, you know, especially where we're at today, that, you know, we're not going to be able to move our country forward without a lot of healing. And a lot of that healing has to do with listening and hearing voices that have been marginalized and ignored for a long time. And that is going to take patience and time for those of us that are holding these spaces, to give those people the time and space to be heard, and to really not just be heard, but feel heard. You know, that's what's going to help create some of this healing. And we just have to acknowledge, those of us working in government, those of us working in planning, that, you know, that was a couple of you mentioned earlier, that the space, these are going to be the spaces where some of that healing has to happen. To Ashley's point, even though we want to be talking about, you know, building form or zoning codes or things like that, that we have important opportunities to help create spaces where people can heal as part of this process. And the other thing about building trust is, you know, trust is critical, because you're never going to have a solution that solves everybody's problems, right? So the process in building the trust that everyone is trying to work together to come up with a solution that works the best for the most people. And I think also, you know, I would put forth at this point, equitable means putting forth, we're helping lift the people that need the most help, right? And that their needs are being prioritized. But trust is eroding. I heard a devastating survey recently around, you know, if they studied the people in the age of like 50 and above, and whether they trust that other people are genuinely good, the vast majority of people said yes. And then they did that same poll of like 18 to 30-year-olds. Do they trust that every person is genuinely good? And the majority of them said no. And that is going to be a problem moving forward, that our younger generations don't have a trust in the humanity of other people. And these processes that we're involved in are going to have to be involved in helping solve those trust issues.
Right. I think you're right. So we've gotten some really great and long questions and responding to some of the things you've said. And I want to move on after this next question to talk a little bit about virtual platforms and how they differ from what I think most of us have used more often in the past, which is face-to-face engagement, and some comparisons and sort of what we've learned over the last few months about the advantages and disadvantages, because I think there was a lot of immediate reaction to using virtual platforms for community engagement, and I'd like to revisit that. So we will go there next, but the point that I think it was you, Ebony, that you made about compensating people for participating, and you all nodded, and I have some thoughts about this, but several other people asked about how do you do that? What if it's not legal in your state? What kind of compensation? If anyone has a little bit more, particularly drawn from your experience, to say about that, if you could address that just for a minute, because we got a lot of questions about it.
Sure. If I can jump in, I know, Ebony, you started that, but I know I've had to twist and turn and try to be flexible, sort of working with the government purchasing and making sure we're staying within regulations, but I also completely agree that majority of the folks who go to the meetings, who are like myself or architects, are getting paid to be at those meetings, and we're asking for people's time. And so we really need to figure out ways to compensate them for their time. What we have done is we can do, so it's not a payment, it's not an hourly rate, it's not anything that they have to claim in future taxes. But what we have done is do a honorarium. In some cases, we've done a stipend. We were working recently with some young people putting this together, but unfortunately didn't get to happen because COVID kind of shut everything down middle of March. But working with young people to pay them to help us survey the neighborhood and do just update the building condition survey. And so with that, it was individual payments to young people, individual payments to the adult leaders who were going to assist us, and those were primarily stipends. Some other things we've done, we've gone to MATA, which is our local transit authority, and got day bus passes, and we'll give them out to people who participate in certain types of events or come to different events. We've done Subway lunch gift cards, and so we did neighborhood tours where neighbors led us on a facilitated tour of their area, and so we were able to give each participant a card, and we still got some left. Some people turned them down, some people didn't. And so I think it's just being creative about what you can do, figuring out what the barriers are up front before you promise and commit that you can do something, but figure out what you can do and then work within those barriers. And then in situations where maybe your agency can't directly pay people, can you partner with a local nonprofit for that same amount? And that nonprofit is much more flexible in what they can do, how they can, provide those funds to individuals who may not have a 501c3 or whatever the case is. And so those are the couple of things that we've been able to do.
I'm on the same place, more like an honorarium. So if you think about engagement, right? So most community meetings, you're probably going to get somewhere between 30 and 100 people. If you actually broke and think about the amount of money and time you spend to get those, and you actually don't know how many people are going to show up. In a similar effort, I just took all of that time and had smaller group meetings with people, focus groups, and I had those coordinated by local organizations, and I offered people $25 gift cards, right? So part of that process, I got 200 people, and how much did I pay for that? A lot less than all of the time and energy it would cost me. So it didn't really cost a whole lot of money. It was just thinking about actually how do you spend that money differently. I think it's also paying, you could also do the same thing. So people hire me and as a consultant, and then part of my budget, I actually pay them. So you sort of go around those rules. And I think I don't think I have had an engagement project in the past 2 years that didn't include hiring somebody locally, even if it was to do outreach, to engage folks, to organize things. That's just sort of a part of the budget, is that they're the local connection. I'm sort of at this sort of strategy level, and they're sort of helping with boots on the ground. And so I think that's another way to really empower people and get them as part of the process, including that in the budget. And I mean, those are not huge parts of my budget. I think you just have to make it a priority and figure out interesting, innovative ways in which to do it. Like I have a very small project now, and a good portion of my budget is always for that. How am I going to engage and pay folks from the community? How am I going to compensate people for their time? Even if it's with food or other incentives, something will go a long way. Even when I do surveys now, I've always a raffle. You enter the win $100 or however much dollars as part of filling out. That goes a long way. It helps me fill out surveys. I'm like, okay, no, everybody likes an incentive. So I think that $300 as part of this to incentivize people to fill out a survey, that's not like a whole lot of money, but it may go a long way.
Calvin or Karen, any thoughts about incentives, recognition, financial or otherwise? Okay.
Nothing that hasn't already been said, but I've done it in East Baltimore and Detroit, and it does work well. It's just a matter of structuring it.
Right. I think we have also had people in the chat talk about providing childcare, perhaps providing food at the meetings. I think those make a lot of sense. And I think if you have people do work like the teenagers that did surveys for you, Ashley, I think that's great. Other people made what I think is a good suggestion, which is that if you're working with local organizations, that you include in the budget some compensation to them to represent. I do believe that that people should be encouraged to participate as citizens when it's in their interest, in their community interest. So I think it's a fine line, but I'll move on with that. And I think it's good training for young people to expect them to put a certain amount of time in on a volunteer basis to participate in making decisions about their community. So that's my opinion for what it's worth. So let's move into this conversation, I think, about virtual platforms. And Calvin, what's different about using a virtual platform from a face-to-face platform? What do you have to think about when you use that as a tool for community engagement?
Oh, there's so much. I mean, we could do a whole panel just answering that question alone. So I'll just kick it off, and I know folks will have a ton of things, but I've always believed that part of our challenge in community engagement is that we are disproportionately biased towards speakers, people who want to speak in front of a crowd, people who are how we deem articulate, who have a what many would call a sort of logical approach to making an argument and presenting a case for a particular position. And that actually becomes exacerbated. That bias, to me, is exacerbated with these virtual platforms, where now so from what I've seen, the only way to participate and put your input in is by speaking. And now there's going to be a little box that really is going to be focused on just you. So to the extent you didn't want to stand up in front of a crowd of 100 people before, now you know that you're going to see 100 faces looking back at you on the screen. And I think that actually will detract from even more people wanting to participate. So, I think part of it will be, and you guys know some of the virtual tools better than I do, but can we use other methods to get input using a virtual tool that isn't just the person speaking and, frankly, writing in a chat box? Because I also think there's a bias there to say, oh, they're going to be able to really crystallize a thought on the fly in a chat box while other people are talking and other chats are happening. Not only the sort of technological dexterity that requires, but also the sort of ability to write in that way, I also think exacerbates some existing challenges. One thing I did as a consultant once in East Baltimore was we did a process called cognitive mapping. I don't know if anyone's ever done that, where essentially you can have people draw what they think about an area, or you can tell them to draw the area. And part of the point there is it's another version of input to allow people to just draw, and you get both direct and indirect feelings about what they think about this particular area or where a project might be or where they belong or not belong. And oftentimes someone might not be able to articulate those feelings. And a real example from that project, people drew the sort of planning area, and they drew these really sort of extremely large looking buildings, which was Johns Hopkins kind of campus, which has no barriers. There's not like fencing around the medical campus, but the buildings were drawn in a way that they really made it seem like this wasn't for me. I'm not supposed to go in there. And they might never say that, or it might not even be a conscious thought, but that sort of non-verbal approach to getting input allowed us to learn some more things that we wouldn't have if you just asked people a direct question or made them speak. So I think figuring out how to use these platforms for non-verbal input is important.
Good. Ashley, I think maybe you've had some experience with that, haven't you?
Yeah, we've had a little bit of experience, and I talk about that, and there were two quick things that I just wanted to kind of chime in with. In addition, one, as we think about virtual platforms, I think the platform is, the platform that's selected is fine, but it's really thinking about what is your audience. So if we bring it back to being equitable and being inclusive, if you know that you're going to have to kind of educate folks on what this new platform is, how to use it, educate staff, etc. That might not be the best tool, so it might be really thinking about using the tools that folks are already familiar with. Maybe you have a small cohort that you can introduce some new tools and techniques and just see if it works out. But I think what we're trying to do is not create another barrier. And so we really want to meet folks where they are. I think one piece that we have to make sure that doesn't get lost in the virtual is the education. And so a lot of times planners are looking for community-driven solutions to problems, but planners may have more quantifiable information than maybe the community does. And so sometimes that may get lost. So if it's just a survey, people might not really know what you're asking. And so even if you do get feedback, you know, it's somewhat useless, because it's one of those things where people have said a certain thing, and then when you go back and they say, well, that's not really what I said, it's because you weren't clear in what you were asking for. You weren't clear in kind of educating and understanding the topic. And so I think we've got to make sure that piece doesn't get lost in it. We've done a little bit of that where we've done a combination of, and it's nothing fancy, but a combination of a presentation and a survey. And this was years ago before COVID-19. And really good success with that. We've also done something that really should have worked, in my opinion. We did text messaging, because everybody's on their phone, and a lot of folks, we've done a couple of things, I'm sure others have as well, but we'll ask people, what's the best way to engage, and kind of take that and try to tailor our strategies. And so a lot of people say use the phones, and our text campaign was the worst performing engagement campaign that we had. And so, you know, probably a multitude of reasons, but still, I think it's figuring out what works for the community, figuring out, okay, let's not put energy in that. Let's kind of look at these other things as well. And so that's where we have gotten in that space.
Thanks. Karen, you had either direct experience or heard about virtual tools that can be used to reach different populations?
I don't know about specific tools. I will answer what Ashley was talking about, the education. We have had some success with being able to save both time and money by pre-recording some of what we would call like brown bag lunches during the charrettes, where we would bring in different experts to help with some of the technical information. And by pre-recording those, then what we can do is we can set up where people can either watch the video ahead of time, or there's like a set time where people might watch it as a group. So let's say and then we host a conversation. So at 7:30 is when the virtual conversation is, and say at 7 o'clock, you know, set your timer to watch it if you haven't watched it before. So people can either watch it before or watch it right before. And then the actual virtual engagement is the conversation of people that have already watched. And it actually is enabling more time for conversation rather than because you're doing the presentation piece of it, the delivery part of it ahead of time. And I think that actually makes for a nicer environment where the community is coming together to discuss rather than to feel like they're being talked at.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just mention that in our first two webinars, the first one we had a case study of a charrette, 4 days in Missoula, Montana, excuse me, that had to go virtual very quickly. And they used a lot of tools to do that. And I would encourage people to watch that because it's a good, it's a good example of a lot of different tools. And the second one we did, they talked about a very simple virtual tool that I liked, which was about, they were deciding where to put bike docks for bike shares. And so they put stickers on the sidewalk and said, we're thinking about putting a dock here. If you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, you know, if you think it's a good idea, text yes to this number. If you think it's a bad idea, text no to this number. So it, you know, it used the cell phones. It was asynchronous, so people could do it in their own time, which is one of the advantages of virtual engagement. So I think there are a lot of tools that we're learning about, and we'll include a link to a Google Doc when we send out the follow-up to this webinar to a list of tools that we put together. Karen?
Yeah, Marta, I just wanted to add two other things. I think one of the concerns, I echo Calvin's concern about, it's always been a process geared toward extroverts rather than introverts. And how are we thinking about ways we can use tools to bring more people in? Another concern that we have is that a lot of the tools that we've been hearing about are about government or consultant to community conversation, right? And so it's you can look at the website and you can send your information to the website and the government or the consultant will hear you, and it's this back and forth. But one of the most important parts of the charrette process and about community engagement is the group to group communication, where different groups in the community, and Calvin talking about the history, like there's history in these groups also, and they might have something going on behind the scenes that really isn't relevant, but they're not going to be able to come together to talk about what's going on here. It is relevant because they can't talk about what's going on here because they have this past history, or these issues. And so I think one of the biggest challenges we face is, and I have to give credit to my business partner, Stefan Pellegrini, for raising this, is this group to group communication. And, and some of the most powerful moments I've ever witnessed in charrettes are when community members hold other community members accountable, right? So it's not the government holding community members accountable. It's not the consultant holding community members accountable. It's the community members themselves kind of holding each other accountable. And how are we going to do that? And how are we going to create processes and create spaces for groups to have those conversations together? I think that's the biggest challenge. I wanted to add one other piece around like meeting people where they're at, and Ashley was talking about finding out the technology that people already understand. I actually think the pandemic has created a great opportunity because a lot of community groups are trying to figure out how to stay connected. A lot of faith groups, a lot of, are trying to figure out how do we stay connected. And so they are doing this work. They are figuring out how to connect people. They are going out and making sure that the people, if they're going to do their church service over Zoom, they're making sure that all of their community members know how to do it. They're partnering community members to like give tech support to make sure they can get connected. They're figuring out how to use Zoom over the phone. So we can tap into that, and I think use this as an opportunity to build, again, what Ashley was saying about we have to have these connections with these community groups before we start the process. So we need to always be building these. Use this as an opportunity to reach out to them and say, what's working? What are you finding that's working? What's not working? What is your community using? Can we build on that for our processes and use this as a way to strengthen our relationships with the different community groups, and find out what they're learning and what's working for them.
I think too, we need to think about, I love what you said, Karen, like what we can do together, which is synchronous, and what we can do asynchronous. And I don't think it's either or, but like the broad range of tools, right? So there's something special that happens when people get together. But I think that what I've seen by and large is we have overly relied on meetings to engage people. There is a certain type of person that's going to spend 3 days at a charrette going to intense meeting, right? And that's like 5% of the population. Most of us will not, including me. I don't go to extra meetings. I want to do asynchronous, and I run meetings for a living. So you really have to be something extra special to get me out to a meeting, right? But if I can, there was another meeting that I was supposed to go in. It was a planning meeting. And I was like, oh, I could go look at all the stuff online in a half an hour and skip this and offer my feedback. So, because that's what I want to do. And I want to have that choice. And I think it's about everybody's different. What do people use, as Ashley said, but how can you have, given your budget, the broadest range of tools, depending on who your audience and who the priority is, and things that people can do that'll take them a minute. And then the person that wants to sit in a meeting for an hour and a half, they get opportunities to do that too, but that's not all you do. And that's, in this day and age, that's not going to be the primary thing you do. Yeah. And I had a project, it's a small project where I'm like, oh, it's only like 500 houses. We're doing a small area plan. I'm like, we can send Eddie, go back to real old school. We can send everybody a postcard, right? Not only what the postcard does is introduces them to a project, give them our website, and then each one of those people can sign up because maybe we want to have a one-on-one conversation or small group conversation with them that we set up. And so I think there's introductory ways that you can get some initial feedback But this community is also full of older people, so they're not going to be signing up for Zoom meetings. They may give me a little feedback, and they may want one-on-one or small group conversations, which we completely do via phone, maybe in person. Are there other ways? And I think we just need to kind of open up to that and just get away from, I have to sit in a meeting in order to give feedback, and really say, what are this we can do? We're going to be in sync. That's important. But what are these other ways and opportunities that we can engage in small ways? And then the people that want to deep dive, which I think is a special group of folks, and probably not most of us, have opportunities to do that as well. The people that want to spend 2, 3, and 5 hours at things, they clearly exist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are great points, Ebony. And I'd say too, just using those same types of tools to provide feedback. So a lot of times we have these engagements, and then, 5 years later, when there's something else that comes down, folks are like, well, what happened the last time we engaged? And so just making sure to keep up that momentum, the same energy that we all put in folks doing our telephone town halls or our Zoom rooms or whatever they are, we do the same. We put out the same energy for kind of like, here's what we heard, here's the next step, or here's what we collectively want to do, whatever that kind of endpoint is or midpoint. And I think postcards is a great opportunity for that, to say, here's kind of where we are, check back in this way. But I think we've got to make sure to, it's not necessarily closing the loop, because I don't think you get start to finish that quick, but we've got to kind of keep that. Yeah, exactly.
And this is what we did with your information, and this is where the project is going to go. Because a lot of people feel kind of like, okay, y'all are back on this engagement. That property is still vacant and nothing has happened.
Yeah.
It really erodes trust. So I think that this part of that is accountability on the role of whoever's initiating the process. Maybe the local government, if they're hiring a consultant to do it, or whomever who is, leading that process, that there is a closing of the loop. Even if, hey, this was all a part of a grant process that we didn't get. Like, community understands that things happen and life happens, but if you don't close that loop, and then it's in their mind a bunch of failed attempts, and I'm not participating.
Yeah.
Oh, Marta, you're muted.
Thanks, I muted so that I could finish coughing. I forgot to unmute, thank you. So how do we know if we succeed? And let's talk first about virtual community engagement. What are our benchmarks for success in virtual community and great engagement activities and tools? Karen, let's start with you. And you're muted, so.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about this ahead of time. Thank you, Martha, for sending us the questions ahead of time. The reality is that the measuring success is exactly the same as it ever was, right? The virtual tools are really just more tools in our tool belt, and they don't change what success looks like. I think to Ebony's point, they give us lots more options. And I think now, again, as many people have been forced to kind of up their game technologically, it does give us a lot more options. So I'm excited about that. But success is going to look the same as it always has. And I think when we're talking about equitable, when we're talking about equitable inclusion, I think that's where the conversation needs to be had. And I think we have not been nearly as successful in equitable inclusion in our community engagement as we need to be. And so I would focus us on, what does that look like? And I'm still processing Calvin's, start at the beginning about it's the outcome, not the process, because again, like from my standpoint, it's always been about, well, we can solve that problem. I mean, honestly, if we look back historically, it has always been white people, we can solve that problem for everybody, right? We don't need everybody included. And so it is in fact about both the process and the outcome. And so, when I was thinking about it, I was like, measuring success is always going to be about being really thoughtful about what questions you're asking for that success, what that success really means. And I think who is really going to be harmed by the decisions that have been made, and let's look deep, right? Like creating retail centers that really are just going to foster big business to come in. who is that really benefiting, and who, you know, who can really afford to spend money in those locations, and who is going to feel welcome in that environment. I think, Ashley, you know, if we get a chance to talk about some of the work in Memphis, the city of Memphis did great work around talking about, rather than retail centers being the center of their communities, having anchors as the center of their community. And what does an anchor as the center of community look like? And it is not necessarily, and it is not retail focused, right? And what are the needs of the different community, and what does the anchor of that community look like? So you have to you're going to have to dig deep to figure out where are the harms and where are the benefits going. And that has to be, I think that's the key question, is who's being harmed and who's benefiting, and being honest and transparent about that. And I think that's the second thing I was thinking about, is a really transparent process, and a process where we are daylighting the power structure, and where we're daylighting those harms and benefits. Thankfully, through a lot of work that a lot of people have been doing in the past 10, 15, I'm sure for a lot longer, but I think technology has really helped us to better communicate those and to better daylight those systems. And I think now, you know, a lot of the reason that these issues are finally, well, hopefully finally getting some momentum around police brutality is because we have technology to show videos of what's happening on the street, right? And we have technology to show videos of why these are systemic injustices, not just bad actors, right? People can use 5-minute videos to explain the systemic piece of the systemic part of the problem, rather than kind of the individual bad actors. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to use the technology to help share kind of what's really going on, and really daylight the power structures of what's happening. I think I'll leave it for there, because I'm sure Ebony and Ashley and Calvin have more to add.
So other thoughts about measuring success, or how do we know when we can declare victory?
I'll jump in, but Ebony, I think you were.
You can go ahead, Ashley.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Ashley, and then
Yeah, my comments are just.
we'll work around my screen.
Okay, sounds good. My comments are somewhat practical. I think Karen is absolutely right. It's, you know, we measure ourselves and the progress the same way we would have. We're just using different tools. What we have found for our office, and it's really two things. It's kind of measurement and benchmarks on the front end, and then outcomes, which in some cases it's who is ultimately decision makers, or have, excuse me, new decision makers that reflect the community been elevated as a part of this process. And thankfully I've been involved in 2 processes where that has been the case, and it feels like a small win, but it's kind of a big victory. But sometimes outcomes you don't see for a couple of years to actually see that things have changed. So that's something we have to stay tuned to. In relation to benchmarks on the front end, it's really hard to do because communities are all different. And so what we have done is we'll look at the whole city. Obviously, there are different communities and different levels of participation, and who is being engaged well, and who we're kind of failing to really build deep relationships with. And so using that information as a baseline to say, okay, we want to make sure we're trying to meet the same demographics as our community. So we're trying to do 70% African-American engagement, and 29% white, and 1%, you know, whatever the case is. But I think that's how you have to do it. You can't just pick an arbitrary number. It has to be based off of something that you've done, something that you've experienced, and then where you know you're trying to achieve and improve on that.
Calvin, Ebony, and then Calvin.
Yeah, so I think this is probably off topic. I think some of the biggest inhibitors to equity is part of the process are actually not the people, but the client, from my standpoint, never really honest about their intentions and their limitations, and never really enough time, right? So whoever's doing the engagement are pigeonholed by, like, you actually kind of know what you want to do, and you kind of want me to do it well. And then you have a really short amount of time to do this. And so I think from a perspective, like, success to me looks like giving more time to the process and being clear, crystal clear and honest about the impact of people's engagement. Even if it's, we want you to give us some insight on this particular window. At least people understand limitations, even if they don't like them. So those are I think the two things that doom processes from the beginning: not honest and not long enough. And I think victory looks like Ashley said, who's participating, who's involved in making the final decisions, and then who is benefiting from the process. And I think if you continue to ask yourself those questions, and are these things representative of the breadth and depth of our community and who's missing from the process? I don't know if I've had more successful processes than others. But I think are people participating? Is that, even if it blows up at points, does it ultimately leave? I don't think blowing up, sometimes the blow up uncovers the things that we actually really need to talk about. And so I think that,
Right.
Nobody wants a meeting that goes off the rails, but that's useful information either way, right? Or what you need to change. And I think setting out, what is my
Except when they're yelling at you, Ebony.
People, I think for our
Yep, no.
Huh?
Except when they're yelling at you. No, Ebony and I have been there working together on a project.
People yell.
Yeah, they do. It's interesting because, Ebony, we had several questions about, and again, we're getting close to the end of our time. And that's why we're going to try and follow up in writing with some of these questions. But we've had several questions about how do you manage a contentious meeting? And I think you've touched on that. You as a group have touched on that a contentious meeting is not always a bad meeting. It's understanding where that contention is coming from and how to use that energy to get you closer to whatever success looks like. Calvin, you're nodding. What do you think about that?
About whether a contentious meeting is always bad?
Well, and about measuring success, and yes, about both of those things.
Well, actually, I'm going to disagree with everybody.
Good.
And my disagreement is, I believe that we should have higher expectations of virtual engagement. If it is truly an additive tool to the things that we already do, then why would we have the same definition of success when it should be bringing something more? If for example, the geographic radius of the people who show up to your usual physical meetings is 10 miles, presumably if you have a virtual tool, maybe you can get a larger radius of people. Maybe you can reach into populations that wouldn't show up to your meetings. I mean, a real example that I think plays out here too is timing. So virtual engagement theoretically, but I've never seen it done, could happen at any time. But what happens typically is people use the tool in the same time frame as they would usually do another engagement workshop. So it's still in the evening. So why are we not doing 24-hour town halls where people can give input irrespective of the time? So for example, I find, and we did this in Detroit as an example when I was a consultant, small business owners don't show up to any of your charrettes, any of your convenings. Why is that? Because they're working during the time that you have them. And they're someone you shouldn't leave out of these discussions, because in many ways, the small business owner is in your community for more time than the average resident, because they're there all day, every day, 6 to 7 days a week. But you do the convenings, the charrettes, at the time they're working. The same for folks that don't work a 9-to-5 job, retail, restaurants, and the like. So I would actually have higher expectations, because this virtual engagement tool should add ways that you can get people that would never show up to a physical meeting at all and get them engaged. Or if you couldn't afford to have someone be a person that does sign language, well, maybe that's much cheaper when you're doing that on a virtual basis. They don't have to go to the meeting. They could literally be on the Zoom screen right here and signing so people could follow, or translators. So I would say I would have higher expectations.
So I think you're right. And some of the tools that we've heard about over this series are just to that point. The Missoula, Montana Charrette enabled, for example, parents with school-age children to participate, because the kids, would come home and they would get them set up on their homework, or they would get them to bed, and then they'd be able to go online and look at the SketchUps for the day. And they had virtual sticky notes that were, as Ebony said earlier, they were asynchronous. You could do that anytime you wanted. You could watch the videos of either the sites or the conversations, and you could comment right then. So I think you're right. So as we wrap up, I guess what I would say is that when I think about community engagement tools and the work we've been doing lately and learning about virtual community tools, I think about this big toolbox. And I think, you got a pocket for voting and getting sort of thumbs up and thumbs down. You've got a pocket for engagement and discussion and back and forth in small groups. And you got a pocket for education and introducing new information. And then now what we've been doing is you got a whole nother shelf full of pockets. And those are our virtual tools. And we tried to use some of them before, but what we've been doing during this pandemic is really populating and learning about those virtual tools, which are effective for different populations, different objectives, different resource limits, and maybe different conditions. Like right now, your virtual tools shelf is moved up because we have to use it more. So any community engagement professional, whether they work for a community or they're a consultant, goes to their toolbox and say, these are the things I need to do, the people I want to reach, the outcomes I need to make sure that I get, and you pick from that toolbox. And so I think what we've been trying to do is to really help people enhance their toolbox, add to the toolbox, and figure out which tools are going to be best for their particular purpose. So you guys have done a great job today, I think, of helping us populate that toolbox, understand that toolbox, take them out and examine some of those tools, but also more importantly, I think in this case, think about the big questions in terms of how do you put the tools that you're going to use together into a program that's going to be as inclusive for the people you want to reach as it possibly can. So I'm going to have to, you always know you've had a good conversation when you're not ready to end it when the time is up, but our time is up pretty much. So unless anyone has just some real important and burning points, I think we're going to go into our wrap up and let people know what comes next. But I want to thank you all so much. What a great conversation, really. And I want to let people know that these are our sponsoring organizations, and that we will be sending out to everyone who registered for this event. We will be sending out in about a week a link to the recorded webinar, answers to some of your questions that we didn't get to, and some email contacts, Twitter feeds and things for our speakers. So I want to thank Holly very, very much for being my partner in organizing this series. And I want to thank each of our participants for joining us today. And then of course, I want to give our panelists a big hand. And also thank you to the MSU and SGA technical folks who help us put this all together. So thanks everybody, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.